name is Dr. Rebecca Hannagan, and I was the Abigail Duniway speaker for the spring of 2013, hosted by the Center for Women, Politics, and Policy. And if you weren't able to make it to the lecture that night, I'm presenting just a little bit of what I talked about in this short video. So my research focus is on women's leadership, particularly at the local level, and gender dynamics, with a focus on processes and policy outcomes. So the evening that I gave the Abigail Duniway lecture, I talked a little bit about why gender matters for politics. And for an audience that would come to a Center for Women, Politics, and Policy lecture, an answer to that question might be kind of obvious. A lot of those who advocate for women's political participation would argue that it hinges on issues of representation as well as equity. But I kind of take the study of women's influence in politics and women's leadership more generally from a slightly different perspective. So why women matter has something to do with their particular leadership style, as well as what they bring to the context of political decision making in terms of altering gender dynamics. So I'm going to talk about those two things just real quickly. In terms of thinking about women's unique leadership style, I've taken my academic bearings from the work particularly of Alice Eagley. She's a psychologist at Northwestern University, and she argues that women embody a transformational leadership style. In short, transformational leadership could be defined as leading from within as opposed to leading from above. And this research matches with some of the early work done on women's political leadership by scholars like Cindy Simon Rosenthal and others who argue that women in politics demonstrate a more democratic leadership style as opposed to an autocratic leadership style, and tend to do more listening and giving opportunities for others to have voice. And so this is consistent with what we would expect from democratic politics. So my question was, if women indeed have this unique leadership style, what does that do to deliberation bodies or decision-making groups like legislatures when you add more women to the mix? So my initial research was looking at how gender composition influences decision-making, and I did so via a series of laboratory experiments. And I found that indeed, if you vary the percentage of men and women in a decision-making group, you see behaviors vary quite differently. This led me to assume that perhaps this dynamic was happening in real-world political settings as well. So I had a rare opportunity a few years ago to take my laboratory research to the field when the state of Iowa passed a law in 2009 requiring all local boards and commissions to be gender balanced by 2012. So before the passage of the law, my colleague Chris Larimer and I, he's at the University of Northern Iowa, we engaged in a field study where we looked at a random sample of decision-making bodies throughout Iowa. We attended roughly 50 meetings of local boards and commissions and found that indeed there was variation in the percentage of women and men on those decision-making boards. Interestingly, what we found was that the boards that were already balanced tended to be cultural boards like Parks and Recreation, historic preservation, and library commissions. The boards that tended to be imbalanced with a much greater proportion of men were economic boards like planning and zoning commissions and zoning boards of adjustment. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be problematic except for the fact that those economic boards tended to be the boards in these communities that held particular sway and particular legitimacy in terms of political power. Many of these boards were also the pipeline to the city council, and even those who had served on those boards went on to serve in state-level politics. So what we found was what many of us who study women in politics might expect to find, is that there does seem to be some barriers and some mechanisms in place to continue to gender certain institutions such that we see sort of male-dominant and also female-dominant decision-making bodies. We also have found that behaviorally, the processes that these various groups engage in look very different depending on the gender composition of the group. We're going to go back into the field world following the passage of the law to see how many of these boards have balanced since January 2012, which was the deadline for the implementation. Just a preliminary assessment looking online suggests that it is indeed these economic boards that are having problems in terms of recruiting women to serve. Much of the work on gender quotas around the world illustrates that gender quotas can be effective and can be successful in terms of balancing legislative bodies, but typically those that are most successful are those with enforcement mechanisms. And unfortunately, the law in Iowa does not have an enforcement mechanisms. Communities simply have to make a good faith effort to recruit either men or women, depending on who is lacking on the given board at a particular time. Encouraging news from this experiment, Iowa being the only state so far with a law requiring gender balance at the local level, is among the mayors that we interviewed. Many of them indicated that where they had the most success in recruiting women to serve were in communities where they had some kind of training institute, whether it was a civic training or something where they could recruit people from the community to come in and learn about how local government works. And several of the mayors I spoke to were very enthused that women were not only interested in learning how things worked, but also excited about the opportunity to step up and serve when a vacancy became available on one of the boards and commissions. This finding that we came across is consistent with some of the research done cross-culturally, particularly by scholars like Mona Lena Crook, who look at the effectiveness of gender quota laws. So one of the things that I was very excited to learn about in my short time at PSU is that the Center for Women, Politics, and Policy have a couple of wonderful leadership programs for young women. New Leadership Oregon, as well as Teens Lead, really position the City of Portland and the State of Oregon well in terms of encouraging women at a young age to get involved and to look at the places where they can bring their unique skill set to bear on the issues of their communities, their universities, their workplaces, and so on. So those are some of the thoughts that I shared during my lecture, and I appreciate you very much watching this, and I hope you support the Center for Women, Politics, and Policy at PSU.